Colossians chapter 1, starting in verse 15 and going through verse 20. The 6 verses of that pericope is one of the greatest and most profound Christological passages you will find in the New Testament. Even as we began looking at this last week, Paul opens with this tremendous statement of who Jesus is when he says, He, that is Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Paul begins with a profound statement of the nature of who this Jesus is. He's the image of God. He's the fullness of the image of the invisible God. And then, following that, he turns to the position of Jesus. He turns in verse 16 to the position of Jesus as the creator and sustainer of all things. And then, as the pericope closes, he ends with the work of Jesus as the reconciler of all things back to himself. So we're going to pick up after verse 15 into verse 16 this morning and come to that second element, the explanation of what Paul means when he asserts that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. What does he mean by that? What we have here is an apologetic. Not an apology, that's different. An apologetic. This is Paul defending what he believes that Jesus is as the fullness of the nature of God himself. The obvious question is, how can one defend the nature of Jesus, the God-man, as being fully the nature of the invisible God? How would you do that? How would you do that? How would you defend Jesus as the nature and fullness of the invisible God? And that would be over against the implication that comes in the second half of verse 15 that he is just a part of creation itself. This is the mistake that many have when they read verse 15. They say, well, sure, he's the image of God, but he's just a man formed from the earth, and so how do we reconcile that? How does Paul make an apologia in regards to that? Now, we certainly realize, even as we noted last week, that Paul considered Jesus to be a part of the creation. Yes, he's a man. He's a man, yes. By virtue of his human nature, which everyone could see, of course. So how would the apostle go about, how would any of us go about defending the position that Jesus bears fully the nature of the invisible God, even though he's a visible man who lived in human history? And that's where Paul is going to go. You might say that this is going to be Paul's apologetic over the Arian heresy that would pop up later in the history of the church, that Jesus was not fully God, but only some sort of deified man, which the Jehovah's Witnesses continue to assert today. That yes, okay, he's the image of God, but in reality he's a man, and so we need to focus on that and try to understand who he is in that sense. In other words, misinterpreting what Paul means by the firstborn of all creation. So the answer to the question, what would be Paul's apologetic, is to assert that Jesus, in his divine nature, as the Son of God, was, in fact, the creator of all things. You can't be a part of creation if you are, in fact, the one who created all things. And so that's where Paul's going to go. He's going to place Jesus outside of the physical creation itself. To assert that a proper understanding of the nature of the Christ assumes that he was involved in actions that can only be ascribed to an eternal, non-corporeal person of divine nature. That's what Paul's going to assert. He's going to assert that this one that we call Jesus was in fact outside of the creation itself, such that he was a part of the actual work of creation. It's actions that can only be undertaken by the Creator himself. So this is where Paul's going to go. Paul's going to begin immediately introducing his apologetic, because I think Paul probably recognized that if we're going to talk about Jesus as a man, we're going to have to recognize who he really is first and foremost in his nature as the divine one. And so this is where he's going to go. And he says, therefore, in verse 16, for by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. All right, we'll pause there for a moment. All right, so let's dig our way into what Paul says. He starts by saying, for by him. Those three words would make a tremendous assertion. The assertion is the creative power of Jesus in his nature as the eternal Son of God. And it starts with the word for. It starts with the word for. The word for in Greek is a conjunction of assertion. Okay, a conjunction of assertion. Because, or for the reason of, might be another way of saying that. Here's how we know that Jesus is as described in the verse 15, the first half of verse 15. Here's how we know. For, see it? And then he says, for by him. Now this is a simple phrase in the Greek, en autos. It should actually be translated in him. In fact, some translations do. For in him. In him, a simple proposition. By the way, this phrase, this proposition is used 2,699 times in the New Testament. It implies something in or through or among the pronoun him, in him, en autos. Implying again the him being the him of this section. Remember, I spent a great deal of time laboring over the pronouns last week of who this is talking about, the him being Jesus. And so in him, in Jesus, this Son of God. So this phrase, by him, or better, in him, for in him, is simply this. It's the source of the action to follow. It is in this one we're speaking of that the creative work about to be mentioned is found. Creation as an action is found to be a part of this one. That's what Paul's saying. It's found to be a part of this one. Now, I agree that translating the word en as by is easier in English. Easier to make sense. For by him, right? Because it's harder for us to understand for in him. In him? Wait a minute. How could it be in him if he's doing something, right? It's a struggle for us. But it is in this one that the creative work about to be mentioned is found. Creation as an action is found to be a part of this one. That's what Paul is suggesting. Jesus is the source or the actor in the work about to be described. It is in him to create. You see it? For in him all things were created. Now, this leaves me with an observation, an obvious observation. Really should have talked about this last week, but time did not permit it. The observation is this. As Paul makes this assertion, for in him, it raises an obvious observation that the man, Jesus, pre-existed his human state. Unlike all other men who come into existence only at the point of their conception. This is the only human ever born into this world who pre-existed his own conception. Now, it's interesting that some commentators and theologians have noticed the fact that Paul never mentions the virgin birth or virgin conception anywhere in his writings. And I say to them, you're wrong. He does, by implication, in places like this. He may not speak of it directly, but he is certainly implying that he believed the substance of such about Jesus, the man. That Jesus, the man, pre-existed his own conception. Now, again, we can talk about the fact that God knows us, right, in eternity past, right? We know from Revelation chapter 17 and several places in Revelation that he writes our names in the Lamb's Book of Life. But that is a theoretical knowledge. It's not an actual reality yet, right? When God knows us, he knows us as an omniscient God would know us. He knows all things, thus he knows us. But we don't exist yet, right? The Christian religion has always held that men come into existence only at their physical formation, at conception, where God imbues the newly formed child with an immortal soul. He does this in secret, in the womb of the woman. We do not come, as some religions suggest, we do not come from a storeroom of souls waiting for bodies. We are formed who we are at the moment of our conception and given a living soul. In fact, if you remember the creation account in Genesis chapter 2, after God had formed the man from the dust of the ground, he then breathed into the man that he became a living being. There's no indication he existed prior to that moment. But at that moment, he became a living being. However, in the case of Jesus, the God-man, the divine nature of the Christ pre-existed his conception. He, as a person, entered into the womb of the Virgin to join his divine nature with a human one that his mother, Mary, provided in her role, as determined by God. So it was a unique incarnation. And notice the word, incarnation. The entry of God into flesh. The only one ever to join his nature with a human one. None of us joined our nature with a human one in the womb of our mother, but he did. Thus, Jesus' divine nature was, as John puts it in his gospel, with God and was God. In the beginning. When? In the beginning. Notice the parallel of that phrase to Genesis 1:1. In the beginning. And it is this reason that Orthodox Christianity teaches that Jesus was without sin, because he possessed nothing of a fallen nature of Adam. There was no concupiscence in his flesh. He was not inherently guilty of Adam's sin, thus doomed to die. Thus, he was able to live without falling to temptation. Why? Because he, the divine one, entered into a human nature. Adam's side of the equation was not present. So this one, by him, who pre-existed his creation, is said to have created all things. All things were created by him. What Paul does here with this phrase is he ascribes to Jesus the totality of the act of creation itself. The totality of the act of creation itself. The divine person in Jesus is responsible for everything coming into real existence. The phrase implies a totality of effort and completion in regards to that which exists. And Paul's going to describe the totality of that creation in the descriptor phrases to follow. He's going to describe what that means. And by the way, I hadn't thought of this when I wrote this outline, so you won't find it, those of you reading my outline. It also implies, doesn't it, Paul believed that things were created. That they didn't fall into existence through some sort of evolutionary process. That God created the heavens and the earth. Or more specifically, that the Son of God present in Jesus created all things. The only human in human history that pre-existed his own conception created all things that are. And Paul will describe then what he means by all things by using several descriptor phrases now, starting in verse 16. All things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities, all things. Now, we'll start with in heaven and on earth. Now, I, as studying this out, believe that what Paul is speaking of here is the realities of both the spiritual and physical planes of existence. The spiritual plane, the physical plane. We'll start with on earth, all right? That one would seem to be the easier of the two. The phrase here is simply the word ge, G-E, ge, on earth. Undoubtedly a reference to the physical plane of existence, on earth, okay? That's simple. So it is likely here that what Paul is referring to is the physical universe with all of its attendant natural laws. Most obviously seen in the physical world that we occupy, meaning specifically that which is material in nature, surrounding us as material beings. A material, physical world, of which we are even ourselves formed from the dust of the ground, right? Now, I'm convinced that this is not limited just to the physical planet on which we're standing. Because if that were the case, how do you describe the physical world to the men walking around on the moon in the late 60s and early 70s? Assuming you're not one of those conspiracy theorists who think that never actually happened. Obviously, they are in a physical world even when they're some 230-some thousand miles from the Earth. Okay. So my feeling is that this word is more than just the physical planet on which we live. It's the world spoken into existence, ex nihilo, in Genesis chapter 1, the creation by the Creator of all that exists in the physical realm and everything that would go along with it. Right? We think of physical matter, right? All the basic elements that make up this universe. And then we add to that things like time and space and light as energy, gravity, the strong and weak forces, and so on and so on. All the things that make up a physical world, all of which, by the way, every bit of which is necessary for our continued existence. We need gravity as much as anything else in order to survive. If we're not for gravity, this little planet we're on would go spinning off into emptiness. So the physical world that God himself spoke into existence, ex nihilo, from nothing. And by clear implication then, humanity, mankind, the intimate formation of, as I've said before, the pinnacle of creation. What was the most important thing God created? The answer is us, humanity. And we see that, of course, in Genesis 2 because God does something very different in creating man than he does in creating all of the things. He doesn't just speak a man into existence. He forms the man intimately from the dust of the ground and breathes into him in an intimate formation and then calls it very good. So I would, in my ever so humble opinion, believe in my Trinitarian understanding of creation that it was the second person of the Trinity who entered into that creation after it was spoken and came and took dust from the ground and formed it into the shape of the creature he himself would inhabit. What did Adam look like? Adam looked like the Jesus that would come many thousands of years later. Not exactly, but similarly. In other words, all of the physical plane, the earth, its substance, and everything around it, everything on the earth and everything that goes along with it. Genesis chapter 1, you will notice, is not limited to just the creation of the earth, is it? Everything needed for this physical world is mentioned in that chapter. So when Paul says that by him or in him all things were created, meaning first, everything on earth, he's speaking of this one, Jesus, forming everything that you can touch, that you can see, that you can hear, that you can feel. But then he also mentions in heaven. Now it's interesting that he uses on the earth, but he uses in heaven. I find that interesting. And I think the reason for that is there's a separation between what is physical and what is unphysical. Is that a word? Probably in this case then, a reference to the spiritual plane of existence. In that, on here, in that. Now this word for heaven here has a huge semantic domain, meaning it has many, many different definitions as used in Scripture. Let me just give you a few just to help you to see it. The word is often used, such as in Matthew 16:2, to describe the sky or, looking up in some way. In Matthew 6:26, the word is also used to describe simply the birds in the air or those creatures who occupy the air above us. Maybe that would include 747s, right? It can also be used, as moving beyond the physical world, it can also be used to describe the abode of God, or the word might be the habitation of God, Matthew chapter 18 and verse 10, or the place of God in the sense of God's position, 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 2, potentially. It can also be used to describe the place of the supernatural, angelic or spiritual beings existing in this place, Acts chapter 7, verse 42. And even, surprisingly, as an indirect reference to God himself. Luke chapter 15, verse 18, when the prodigal comes back and confesses to his father, he says, I have sinned against you and against heaven. Well, who's he? He's sinning against someone, not against something. So it's an indirect description even of God himself. So how do you take that wide semantic domain of a word and apply it here? What is it that Paul is trying to say? And I think given its contrast with the word earth, Paul is probably referring to the plane beyond the physical one. Plane, P-L-A-N-E, right? The plane beyond the physical one. The plane of existence outside of human physical experience, occupied, quotation marks, by spiritual beings and or powers, or more specifically, non-corporeal beings. Beings without physical flesh or physical existence. A plane of existence different from the one we're on. That one is in. We're on this one. Where the angels gather, for example, Job chapter 1. Remember, God called a council of the angels to come together, Job chapter 1. It's the place envisioned in Isaiah chapter 6, when he has a vision and he's transported to this place, where Paul was invited in 2 Corinthians 12:2. In fact, Jesus himself calls it the genesis of his own mission in Matthew chapter 3 and verse 2 and John 6:38. I have come down from heaven to do the place of my Father. Or he sometimes speaks of it as the consummation of his kingdom would ultimately be. The kingdom of heaven, all over the place in the gospel accounts. The place where the risen Christ now sits, ruling over the physical realm, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 24. Or where the righteous ascend after death. We might call it the place of the intermediate state, what Jesus called paradise to the thief on the cross in Luke 23, verse 43. In other words, if you take all of that and put it together, what you come up with is the indescribable place, and notice I'm putting that adjective there, the indescribable place that exists on the spiritual plane. The realm of creation formed by the Creator above the earthly plane, to exist above humanity as a part of God's larger decree. Now, I would contend this is separate from the heavenly bodies of day 4. It's simply too simple to say that the heavens is just the galaxies above our head. There's another plane of existence. Remember, God created the heavens and the earth, but he formed the stars in the sky on day 4. Noted implicitly in Genesis 1:1 as a part of creation, but not specifically outlined as to how or where. For example, where exactly was it that Satan fell from heaven? Luke chapter 10, verse 18. Jesus said, I saw him fall. When? Where? Well, at some point, God created another plane of existence. Another plane of existence. It's a spiritual plane. It's not a plane that's physical. It's a place different from this one, where the angelic beings reside, where the council of Job was called, where Jesus even himself sits ruling over the nations of the earth. Now, this is, as I said, indescribable because it's one of those things that's like, okay, how exactly do we describe this, and where do we put it, and how does it look, and what are all these beings like? And again, the scripture gives us no scientific answer to that question, because here's the problem. How do you measure and quantify scientifically a plane that doesn't exist in the physical world? I mean, does a 12-inch ruler still work in the spiritual plane if it's not in the physical world? That's our problem. See, we try to measure everything on the basis of what we know in this world, because guess what? We only know this world. And so we try to describe this heavenly plane as though it can be measured and managed according to our thinking in this world, but I'm sorry, it can't. It's a different plane of existence. And this Son of God that pre-existed his incarnation created both planes. He created a physical plane and he created a spiritual plane. In the spiritual plane, he put the angels. In the physical plane, he put us. And I think Paul uses the next two words to describe, again, the difference between the two. Visible and invisible. That which can be seen by us and that which cannot be seen by us. Right? Visible, it can be seen. Invisible, it cannot be seen. Now, contrary to the term for heaven, the two words that Paul uses here, which are very close to each other, they have very simple semantic domains. You can search the scriptures looking for deep answers to these words. They're very simple. What you can see, what you can't see. That's it. So I think what Paul does in this case is take the previous phrase and redescribes it by using these two words. The physical plane, what we can see. The spiritual plane, what we cannot see. People are visible. Angels are not. Right? It's that simple, I think. It's that simple. People are visible, angels are not. Well, unless they manifest themselves into the material plane by making themselves visible, which they do, which they can do apparently, so they can cross the boundaries between the spiritual and the physical planes. But generally speaking, they're invisible. Now, let's note something here. Technically, God himself, Yahweh, the Creator, exists outside of both, doesn't he? He exists outside of both of these planes. Yahweh does not intrinsically inhabit either plane, for he created both out of his eternal nature. Yes, he interacts with both planes. He can interact with those of us on earth. He can interact with those who are in the spiritual realm. He can do that, each according to his divine decree and purpose. And so in some sense, we could say that he is visible and invisible. He's invisible in the sense that when he is in the heavenly realm, choosing to abide there, even as the Son of God is now, he is invisible. No one has seen Christ sitting upon the throne of heaven except those who are invited to go into that spiritual plane briefly and see him, but that's it. Or when he decided, as he did with the Apostle Paul, to make himself visible. And when he did break across that boundary, the results were blindness for the guy that saw it because it was so powerful. So he's invisible, but he's also visible in the physical realm, is that he now comes into this world as the God-man. You see, coming from the spiritual realm, he comes into the physical realm, makes himself known. But he himself exists outside of these planes. Remember, they did not exist prior to the creation. Either one of them. Neither one of them existed before God began his creative work. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So he exists outside of both of them as their creator. So what Paul is asserting here is that Jesus is the creator of all realities, physical and spiritual. The pre-incarnate Christ, the pre-incarnate Son of God, now incarnate in Jesus, was specifically the agent of creation, existing himself beyond those physical and spiritual realms that he formed, existing beyond the visible and invisible, existing in a level beyond all of that. It's hard for us to get our minds around that because we are physical creatures. We're bound to this physical world. Everything in this world is measurable. But God exists in a plane that is immeasurable. Immeasurable. I would argue, by the way, if I might be so bold, that the members of the spiritual realm are also measurable. They're finite. They're not infinite. Do not make the mistake of ascribing to Satan more than what he actually possesses. He is not omniscient, and he's not omnipresent. He is a created being, as we are, living, however, in a different plane. So when we measure him, we measure according to the standards that he lives in his world. But we do not need to ascribe to him some sort of godlike nature by virtue of being in the spiritual plane. If I might be so bold, I don't think any of us in this room have ever been tempted directly by Satan himself. Possible, certainly. But he's got many more folks that are important than us. As I said, often I think his abode is Washington, D.C. So, for by him, or better, for in him, in his creative work, in his very nature, his ontological nature of being the one who is the creator, all things were created, all substance in heaven and earth, visible and invisible. But then Paul goes to another level. Because it isn't enough just to say that Jesus is the one who created everything. It's also important to establish that Jesus is also the creator of everything within those things, and more specifically, the powers that exist within those things. Thrones, dominions, rulers, or authorities. The various rankings of that which is established as powers within the either spiritual or physical worlds. Now, and have you note something here that many commentators point out. The phraseology that Paul uses here, when he uses thrones, dominions, rulers, and authorities, the phraseology suggests that Paul is using the predominant Jewish terms for the various rankings of angels here. Various rankings of angels. The same term, authorities, is used in Ephesians 6:12. Remember that passage. Our fight is not against flesh and blood, but against authorities, powers. Okay? So Paul is probably thinking along the lines here of the various rankings of angels. However, it is also reasonable to assume that Paul is actually using sweeping terms here to describe every kind of authority within the created order on both planes. So he's not just talking about rulers and thrones and dominions in the spiritual realm, he certainly is, but not only there. He could be speaking, for example, of angels along their various rankings. We know that there are rankings of angels in Scripture. We don't really understand how those rankings work. They've never really been unfolded to us as to which type is stronger than the other and which is more important than the other. You know, is it this kind, a cherubim or a seraphim, or is it this or that? I don't know. And don't ask me. But it can also be, from a physical way of thinking, various aspects of human existence. Thrones, of course, represents kings who sit upon such thrones. Dominions can be things like nations or alliances of nations, right? When you think of dominions. Rulers would be subordinate officials, say, to a king, like a magistrate. Authorities would be things like lawmakers and judges. In other words, these words can not only describe the rankings of angels, but they can also describe all the rankings of basic levels of human authority, from the king on down, through every level of authority in the world. Paul could also be thinking here about the rankings of authorities even within the church. Apostles, prophets, teachers, elders, shepherds, right? Ephesians 4. The rankings of various kinds of positions in the church that are necessary for the ongoing work of the church. He could also be thinking, of course, about the rankings of authority within the family. Fathers, mothers, masters, all within the framework of the family. Notice, you could take these words and you could say it applies to every sphere of human existence. Government, church, family, whatever. All the various kinds of authorities that go into making this world. Certainly in the spiritual realm, but obviously also here on earth. Suggesting that Paul is pointing out that within the totality of creation, there are levels of authority established by God himself as a part of his work of creation. It is agreed, isn't it, within a Christian worldview, that God himself is the one that establishes authority and is given authority over to some. He establishes subordinate authorities over creation. Levels of authority that derive their existence from God, established by him for the management of his creation. Apparently, Satan was above other angels, established to rule over them in some sort of way, till he fell. Kings established to maintain human order, Romans chapter 13. Elders to lead the local church, fathers to lead their families and homes, masters to lead businesses or other kinds of things. See? God himself has established authority in the earth. That's where Paul is going here. You see, it's one thing to create the heavens and the earth, but it's another thing to put order into them, which is what he does. God puts order into these things, which is why Paul goes where he goes. Leadership, given delegated authority from the Creator himself. Authorities to act in his interest in governing aspects of the spiritual world and physical world. Physicality requires authorities because it requires order, and God purposed that. And so Paul asserts that Jesus, the pre-existent Christ, was the creator of all powers in both physical and spiritual realms. The pre-incarnate Son of God, now incarnate in Jesus, was specifically the one who established authorities, all subordinate to him. This is an assertion by Paul that the Christ who pre-incarnated Jesus, but who entered into the man to become Jesus, established the heavens and the earth, gave substance to both planes, and then gave authority, delegated his authority into both planes. Paul listing everything that Christ Jesus created as the image of the invisible God, and over which he now has authority and dominion as the God-man incarnate. What does he say in the Great Commission? Before he tells the disciples to go and make nations, what does he say? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. In heaven and on earth. All things were created through him. This is the summary of the statement. Now, I have you note something here. Let me just pause for a moment. Let's put a parenthesis right here. Okay. Paul may be hinting here. Okay, I think I'll take out the word maybe. Paul is hinting here at the point he's making in this Christological passage. What's he trying to say, talking about Jesus as the Creator? What's his point? What's he trying to communicate? And this is it. Those who have set themselves up as authorities in the Colossian church are illegitimate. That's what he's saying. He's going to go after those people who have come to the village at Colossae insisting that the Christians should follow them into various outward rituals, asceticism, worship of angels, which I find fascinating here. No time to get into it. And what Paul may be saying here is that there's only one authority. Because all authority in heaven and on earth, established by the Creator, comes from Him. Jesus, the God-man, the one who pre-existed His birth in Bethlehem, who established and created all things. We're going to see these authorities in chapter 2, by the way. When we get there, let's remember this passage, right? But let's be clear that any authority, quote unquote, any such men have, is subservient to Christ's ultimate authority over the world first, and then more explicitly over the church. These men have no right to come into the church and establish doctrines or practices of the church outside of Jesus' express wishes. They are not the Creator, and they're not the head of the church. Notice in verse 18, and He is the head of the body. We'll get there, okay? Paul's going to continue this thought here in a second. So in this case, what Paul is saying is there's only one who has the power to create any authority. And that is the one who created the heavens and the earth. It is the one who established whatever powers He wished in the earth, including the authorities in the church. Which is one of the biggest reasons why we, as the elders of Grace Fellowship Baptist Church, say, this ain't our church, it's His. And He may do with it as He wishes. We are His under-shepherds. We have no authority of ourselves. The only authority we have is an authority granted to us by Christ to do His will. Even as He Himself said, I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of the one who sent me. Even He was subservient to the will of the one who had sent Him. And this, I think, is where Paul is really emphasizing, or what Paul is really emphasizing at this point. Jesus, the God-man, the one who lived in Nazareth and died in Jerusalem and rose from the dead, this one is the ultimate king. This one. He is the king. He is the King of kings and Lord of lords. Even that's expressed in 1 Timothy 6:15, Revelation 17:14, and Revelation 19:16. He is the creator of heaven and earth and everything in it. He is. You see, when we gather together as a people to worship, we are worshiping a man who is also the divine Son of God, the God-man, who died and was raised and ascended to heaven. We worship Him as the authority of authorities. He is the one. He is greater than anything because He is the fullness of Yahweh. The church's mission, the church's focus, the church's energy is Him. And not some, I don't know what adjective I'd use to describe the vision that many people today have of Jesus. I'm saddened by the particular views of Jesus that are promulgated in our day. But this is a vision that Paul has of Jesus being without limit, ultimately powerful, and not concerned, per se, with our happiness or our health or how well we get along with each other, but concerned about his glory. Concerned about his glory. He's not so worried about how things are going to turn out in this world. He's taking care of that. He created it. He established the authorities. He gets to decide. He is the one that the Father has given him all authority. Our worship then is of a Christ who is fully and in every way the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And he gets to decide all powers and their extent. He is the true sovereign. He's the true sovereign. Jesus Christ, the God-man, the man who walked in Nazareth and walked in Galilee and Samaria and Judea and was crucified by the Romans and rose from the dead, that man who is now seated at the right hand of his Father in the spiritual plane, he is full of glory. And it's all about him. It's all about him. Okay, I'll say it again. It's all about him. It's not about you, and it's not about me, and it's not about the church. It's about him. That's what Paul is saying. Listen, this one who's the image of the invisible God, created all things and then established authorities in all things, all subservient to him. Which means, my friends, listen, hear me. Subjection to Jesus is not theoretical. We serve him, period. Christianity is not about getting some sort of get out of jail free card at the end of your life, which so many believe it is. No, the true Christian religion, centered around this man, is that we who know him are in absolute subjection to him. His word is absolute. His authority is absolute. His ownership of us is absolute. We got to give up this idea that when you come to Jesus, you still get to decide what you're going to do with the rest of your life. To receive his saving grace even requires a willingness to submit to his absolute authority. If you will confess Jesus as Lord. Absolute, without limitation, the one to whom all authority belongs. That's a radically different view of Christianity, isn't it? I mean, I've seen people write books called, radical, but I didn't see that radical in the book. Because that's radical. We come to this Christ and we look at him and we see him as the God who created all things, and we bow before him with absolute allegiance. Period. He is the one who created all things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him. All things were created through him. Now, there's a little phrase at the end of that verse which takes an entire sermon to unpack. Because not only are all things created through him, but all things are created for him. So, if you'll allow me, we will continue on. You got another hour? And all God's people said, yeah, we're out of here, pal. Next week, Lord willing, we will cover that last phrase.